Welcome to the channel. For those who don't know me, I'm a historian who tends to focus on historical criminals, such as pirates. Obviously, crew the fancy. What would you expect? As well as Pennsylvania history. Being a historian, I tend to focus on the visual and written record. But today, I figured I'd mix things up a little. As always, if you want to support the channel, YouTube doesn't seem to understand what Red Sea pirates we talk about, so yeah, we have a GoFundMe and a Patreon. Feel free to donate, join, whatever. And slight disclaimer, just because I'm going to be talking about indigenous history, I am not claiming American Indian heritage. I have none. I am a historian. I love history, and I want it to be accessible to everyone. So save the weird comments. Also, slight formatting note. I wrote a script beforehand, but I'm probably going to go off of it. Initially, this started out as a video about fishing weirs, and I'm going to say maybe about a third of the videos about that. I kind of doing a deep dive into local history, and all because of a fishing weir. So, uh, those of you who enjoy rabbit holes, join me. History is fun, but at times it's frankly annoying. There is popular history, and then there's academic history. Popular history is designed to be easily read and often misses a few points here and there. Sadly, it is usually this history which influences politics. And yeah, a little bit later, things are going to get a little bit spicy. Don't worry, it's historical politics. It's not current, so when it comes to marketing and all those lovely things required to keep historic sites going, the history often falls into a time period that people are familiar with. In the case of Pennsylvania, founded in 1681, it tends to skip 75 years and goes immediately to the time between the 7 Years' War and the American Civil War. Don't get me wrong, we usually have involvement with such great names as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and sites like Valley Forge and Gettysburg. This trend carries over to many of the towns. My town, which I'll be focusing on for much of this video, is said to have been established in 1755 and was incorporated in 1828. In reality, its story goes back much further than that. Middletown has a rich history of canals and railroads. It's a small town located south of Harrisburg and tends to view itself as rural, although it plays host to Harrisburg International Airport, formerly the Olmsted Air Force Base, and became known to the world with the 3 Mile Island incident. A little geography. Middletown proper is situated on a hill overlooking the mouth of Swadera Creek into the Susquehanna River. There are multiple historically known stream beds running through the town, giving streets such names as Water and Spring, even though they only live up to their names when the remnants of a hurricane reminds residents that the land remembers. Note to future home buyers, consider talking to local historians. We know where the old streams are, or if you are building your in-ground pool in a forgotten cemetery. Yes, I know, oddly specific, and yes, it happened. And I went looking for a cemetery that I had the address for that was established, I think, in the early 19th century, and I found an in-ground pool. I did not let the homeowners know. But if you're watching this and you have questions about your in-ground pool and maybe some things that you found while placing it, yeah, feel free to hit me up. I'll give you the history. Middletown is considered to be in the Piedmont Geologic province. This land, a mix of sediments from the erosion of the Appalachian Mountains and a 500 million year old volcanic arc, puts the town at the top of a vast area of fertile soil. Many tourists associate it with Amish country and the Gettysburg battlefield. Due to the volcanic nature, we have plenty of odd, igneous, and metamorphic rock outcroppings, which have stood the test of time and also tend toward the rockiness of the Susquehanna River in our region. The Appalachians are among the oldest mountains in the world at 480 million years old. They predate bones. And the Susquehanna River, which predates several of the orogenies which built the Appalachians, is dated to at least 320 million years old. People first arrived in the region at least by 10,000 years ago, with the Meadowcroft rock shelter near the Ohio border being dated as early as 19,000 years. Initially, it was very controversial for that date, but with the discovery of more pre-Clovis sites that are potentially older, there's less of a controversy. I mean, there's still questions. There's also a few sites in the Chesapeake Bay, which Susquehanna feeds into, being dated at around 13,000. I know we do not have a complete picture for my region exactly. So I'm gonna say it's more than likely around 10,000 that we know of. Several Paleo-Indian sites are known in the Susquehanna Valley, to include one in Dauphin County known as the Shoup site. And this is where I hit my first hurdle. Just north of Harrisburg, the Shoup site was documented in the 1930s. There have been multiple digs since, including at least one in the 2010s. Over 7,000 artifacts have been recovered. Now, this site, for the most part, dates back about 10,000 years. I first learned of the site while following a lead to artifacts housed at the Penn Museum. After digging deeper, my next piece came from a repatriation document in reference to a museum in Oklahoma which acquired human remains and grave goods from the Shoup site. Being a historian, I tried to find more documentation, but sadly, I could find nothing. I thought about messaging the museum, but I'm not entirely sure it's a good topic with them. The lead which took me to the Penn Museum also seemed to be a bit critical of the lack of documentation for artifacts from Middletown. They were acquired by a Philadelphia-based antiquarian society in the late 19th or early 20th century. The extent of the documentation was simply Middletown up. We have no record of a dig, no record of potentially a street or landmark, simply Middletown up. Now, some of the artifacts, they look like they were in the water a while, so it could have been along the creek or the river, but then some of them look kind of fresh, like they were pulled from the ground. The exciting thing about the artifacts is that many of them fit point styles which lean into the Archaic, so we're looking at around 11,000 to 4,000 years old, to some which are younger. The younger ones are also important. That's coming up. Oh, and nobody can seem to agree on the specific timeline of periods within Pennsylvania. I'm going to try to use them, but different sources might give you different date ranges. So I'm going to, like when I say archaic, I'm going to give you a time frame. If I say woodland, I'm going to give you a time frame. I think except at one point where it's just kind of a general. Calver Island between Middletown and Harrisburg, sitting below the Turnpike Bridge, was under U.S. Army Corps of Engineers authority, and they ended up having proper archaeological work done, which is part of the rules. Multiple layers have shown multiple periods of use since the late Archaic. Due to the seasonal flooding of the river, many of the islands are not settled at present, and as a result, though, there's a lot of undisturbed stratigraphy, so it's a lot easier to date these sites. Now, that said, some of the larger islands are inhabited, and I know there's been artifacts found on them here and there. The sad part about all of this, we know very little about the people that existed in this region. And that sadly has led more to just ignorance than speculation. And I need to stress that is not willful ignorance. Sadly, many people don't realize how important some of their random finds are. And they often get tossed in the family collection, sold on eBay. And if it's pottery shards in somebody's garden, they might just throw them in the trash. As many have noted in other videos, in the Northeast, there's been a lot of development and little attention was given to archaeology. We also have very few enforced laws protecting potential sites and requiring notification of authorities. Like, cool, you find some points along the river or creek. That's rescuing them from a flood, and they likely came in with a flood. But in Facebook groups, we often see people recovering points and other artifacts from fields. This practice has been ongoing since the 19th century. At the very least, call somebody so it can be properly documented. Send an email, something like that. I'm not happy with that because in the one group of people, we do have names and they do have a story. They're not just random stones. And that brings us to why I even started this video. We don't know who built the eel weir. We don't even know when. There's a similar site in Maine dated to 6,000 years by the remains of a fish basket found at the tip of one of the triangles. It maybe doesn't even matter. People used the fish weirs from the time they were built well into the colonial era and even later. When I say later, we're talking into the early 20th century. There was still commercial eel fishing in the Susquehanna, sometimes utilizing weirs that were built potentially thousands of years ago. It's one of those moments where conspiracy theorists were almost right. They just missed which stone structures. So there's been a couple with the Tartarians. If you saw my video on that, they'll be talking about the canals and things like that. And it was an earlier civilization. Well, the eel weirs were built by an earlier group of people, and they were still being used again into the 20th century. There are stories from Danville, Pennsylvania, known for an exceptionally large pre-contact triangular weir, and a new one built in 1908, of children selling eels on the street up until around the time that eels disappeared. And sadly, they did when the hydroelectric dams blocked the path of the American eel in the Susquehanna, and their importance ceased. Weirs appear throughout the Susquehanna River and in multiple tributaries. With the construction of the canals, there may have even been more. We just don't know. Further, fishing laws and attempts to make rivers more navigable saw the destruction of many weirs as early as the 18th century and well into the late 19th century across the Northeast. Weirs globally are some of the earliest evidence of hominids making structures to make their lives easier. There's a bit of a controversial site in Africa which shows the typical signs of weir construction and may date to Homo erectus. If confirmed, people have been building them since essentially we became people. Uh, while I was researching this, I found a whole bunch of scholarly articles on Homo erectus fishing and cooking fish. Apparently, they knew how to cook fish at low heat, which I mean that's incredible. Stoner wood, they are triangular and used to focus and gather migrating fish. Frankly, I find them fascinating because they are early tech which our genus seems to have used, and thus the same idea appears wherever hominids went. So when we talk about different technologies that, oh, well, it's the same here and it's the same there, and this is one of them. And the reason is it developed very early. So wherever you find people, you're going to find similar structures. In the northeastern United States, the practice was used to catch migrating eels in vast numbers in baskets, gut them, hang them to smoke over the fire. And then they would be a major source of protein during long winters. A lot of the accounts will talk about actually hanging them up in the rafters of the longhouse. There you could also have a purpose-built rack. Sometimes they were even used in trade. Think of them a bit like fishy beef jerky. French explorers described being traded them and at first not eating the skin. They actually gave it to their dogs, but then as their food supplies ran out, they'd actually fight the dogs for them. American eels have seasonal movements in freshwater bays and rivers. But what's very fascinating is that they start their lives in the ocean. The American eel starts its life cycle in the Sargasso Sea. It's a fairly calm area of the Atlantic Ocean, north of the Caribbean and to the east of the continental United States. It's bounded by the Gulf Stream and the oceanic currents. After a journey that can take years, the eel ends up in fresh water where they feed and mature for 10 to 25 years and then migrate back to the Sargasso Sea to complete their life cycle. At present, they are considered endangered and at risk of extinction in the wild. Keep in mind, they were being harvested in vast numbers for thousands of years, but it was the construction of dams in the early to mid 20th century that severely affected their numbers. With nowhere to mature, they are sadly declining. There's been a move to get rid of some of the dams and improve some of the fish ladders, so we can potentially restore their numbers. This eel weir in particular is personal to me. As a kid, when my largemouth bass hole at the mouth of an old canal would dry up, I'd ride my bike across the Swadera to a little rock outcropping, and I'd usually have some luck with smallmouth bass. It wasn't until recently that I realized the significance. Whoever built the eel weir used the natural rock formations and enhanced them into a series of triangular shapes with smaller rocks. Its placement just before the rapids would concentrate migrating eels to be caught. They would likely be tired and thus make them easier to catch. When examining the photographs of another eel weir near the I-81 bridge in Harrisburg, you can actually, I mean, if you're, don't stop on the bridge, okay? Find another way to look for it. I first noticed the placement of smaller stones in relation to the regular boulders in the river. Nobody was moving the boulders were already there. The smaller rocks, though, whoever built both of these structures was working smarter, not harder. Now, City Island nearby does have an archaic site, which was actually my first experience being around archaeological work. That was back in the early 1990s. I even forget what grade I was in. I mean, it's my first time getting to see archaeologists working in the field. It's actually under the parking lot at City Island if you ever go see a Harrisburg Senators baseball game. I don't really like baseball. Up on a nearby hill in the town of Lemoyne is another site that's a bit later. It's a Susquehannock site from roughly the 1630s, and that was dated from some of the trade beads that were found, and it's identified as Susquehannock by some of the remains of pottery, which I'll get into a bit later here. And that brings us to the first solid piece of evidence I could find as a historian for my local eel weir. The French, starting in the mid-17th century and continuing long after, marked the area as Swahadauri. If you notice, the maps show a circle, which is what they use to mark towns. It's not following the creek, which is how they typically labeled those. Swahadauri is a corruption of a Susquehannock word meaning where we eat eels. So who were the Susquehannock? We don't know what they called themselves. The Algonkin-speaking interpreter who introduced them to John Smith called them Susquehannock, the people of the muddy river. The Wendat, an Iroquois-speaking people, called them the Andastarohanan, the people of the blackened ridgepole. The Lenape, another Algonquin-speaking people, called them Menque, which was what the Swedes and Dutch used as Minquas, which seems to have been an insult meaning sneaky or treacherous. After the tribe was forced into the region around the Conestoga River in the 1690s, they became the Conestoga in most of the English sources. The French initially called them Andaste after the Iroquois word, but later called them Gondastoga. Sound familiar? Again, we don't know what they called themselves. There's some thoughts that Gondastoga or Conestoga might actually be the proper name. Typically within history, they're referred to as the Susquehannock. If we find evidence later on, that could change. We do know they were an Iroquoian-speaking people who moved from the northern branch of the Susquehanna River into Pennsylvania around 1500. They likely came out of New York and came down the northern branch into south central Pennsylvania. We know they shared most of their language and likely some of their culture with the Iroquois, but they were not recognized as part of the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, when I started working on this, I started realizing I was getting way over my head, so I reached out to Drew Shuptar Rayvis, a citizen and cultural ambassador of the Pocomoke Indian Nation and Algonkian living historian of the 17th and 18th century. And frankly, he's one of the best Native American historians of the Northeast. Like, if I see a documentary with him, it's definitely going to be good. He wanted me to stress the point, though, that They were culturally distinct, although they spoke a language of the Iroquoian family. In 1608, we get our first introduction to the Susquehannock in English from John Smith. He met them while exploring the Chesapeake after coming from Jamestown. I'm going to read his full quote and then we're going to analyze it. Upon this river inhabit a people called the Susquehannock. 60 of those Susquehannocks came to the discoverers with skins, bows, arrows, targets, beads, swords, and tobacco pipes for presents. Such great and well-proportioned men are seldom seen, for they seem like giants to the English, yea, and to the neighbors, yet seemed of an honest and simple disposition, with much ado restrained from adoring the discoverers as gods. Those are the most strange people of all those countries, both in language and attire. For their language, it may well beseem their proportions, sounding from them as it were a great voice in a vault or cave as an echo. Their attire is the skins of bears and wolves. Some have cassocks, capes, made of bear heads and skins that a man's neck goes through the skin's neck, and the ears of the bear are fastened to his shoulders behind, the nose and teeth hanging down across its breast, and at the end of the nose hung a bear's paw. One had the head of a wolf hanging in a chain for a jewel. His tobacco pipe, 3/4 of a yard long, prettily carved with a bird, a bear, a deer, or some such device at the great end, sufficient to beat out the brains of a man with bows, arrows, and clubs suitable to their greatness and conditions. These are scarce known to the Powhatan. They can make near 600 able and mighty men, and are palisaded in their towns to defend them from the Massawomacks, their mortal enemies. This is actually my first time reading this quote out, and I realize he gets very obsessed with the bearskin. They were not giants. I need to stress this because there are some in the pseudo world that have latched onto this statement and keep exaggerating it and adding new claims to it. Remains found in York and Lancaster show a height of around 5'7" for men, which is comparable to modern people. They weren't giants, but they would have been noticeably taller than just about everyone else. Why? This goes back to geology. The Susquehannock would move their towns every 25 years or so after the land around them had been exhausted through slash and burn agriculture. This was not the most ecologically friendly method of doing farming, but their practice allowed them to eat well for the time that they were in a location. As well as eels and game such as deer, they'd have a healthy diet of maize, beans, and gourds, the three sisters. They were doing this on soil which we've already established was very fertile. Unlike most people in the 17th century world, they weren't dealing with malnutrition. Smith also got the pipes right. Animal figure pipes, sometimes of great length, are often hallmarks of Susquehannock archaeology. The figure would face the smoker. These ends, carved of soapstone or even sometimes clay, would be at the end of a hollowed out wooden stem. There are also smaller varieties for more everyday smoking. And unlike many tribes, Susquehannock seem to have been very slow about adopting European trade pipes. Their towns were palisaded and often located on the high ground. Most of the documentation in history is focused on a few sites in the lower Susquehanna near the Chesapeake. But the French maps show several sites further north that were visible, if not active, in the time period. There are also a few locations which don't appear on the maps, which have very obvious Susquehannock artifacts. With them moving sites every 25 years, there are definitely more sites than would account for such movement if we accept the 1500 arrival date, which, based on the evidence, there's no reason to doubt that time frame. So, although myself and others will focus on usually one large village, keep in mind there are initially between 5 to 7,000 Susquehannocks spread between a few active villages at any one time. And they very much, as John Smith noted, were warriors. Bows and arrows begin to appear during the late woodland period in the northeast. The points tend to be smaller than the spear and atlatl darts seen before. Now, this is very helpful in dating sites. There's a specific type of triangle point, slightly wider than the usual ones, referred to as a Susquehannock point. I am not an archaeologist or a point expert. One of the Middletown artifacts at the Penn Museum is likely such a point. These would be replaced by firearms. The clubs mentioned would in some cases be replaced by hatchets we collectively call from the Algonkian tomahawks. More than anything else, though, I agree with Smith's assessment of their attitudes and mannerisms. The Susquehannock controlled a very valuable resource. They had the military might and know-how to defend it, and the diplomacy to make sure they'd get the best value. Susquehannock were at the center of the Beaver Wars. It's not like the Australian Emu War. These were a series of conflicts from 1609 to 1701 involving many tribes and various European powers. The Susquehannocks' position on the Susquehanna granted them the status of middleman between the Iroquois and many of the Europeans for access to the beavers, whose pelts were highly sought after for stylish hats. This one's wool, but the same style would have been made out of beaver. Keep in mind, these were so popular, it nearly led to the extinction of beavers. And like many, they realized they would get certain deals with the Swedes, Dutch, and French that they wouldn't with the English. In 1626, the Susquehannock traveled to New Amsterdam to establish formal relations with the Dutch. The Lenape, living near the Delaware, had been unable to supply beaver pelts due to raids by the Susquehannock. There is some debate over how the Susquehannock and Lenape came to terms. Based on what I have found as a historian, I don't feel as though we give the Susquehannock enough credit as politicians. The Dutch would become one of the primary trading partners with the Susquehannock. See, the English were not initially keen on trading arms to the locals. They were planning to stay, and they saw potential consequences down the road. The other European powers, they tended to try to use local support, so they didn't really see an issue. As a result, early on, the Susquehannock were being supplied with flintlock weapons. Keep in mind, this was the time period when many English colonists and militia were still being equipped with matchlocks. I mentioned Drew before. He's part of an excellent collaboration on King Philip's War with Attaché Films. Much of the weapons discussion is very relevant to what we're talking about here. I'll include a link. Definitely check out that video. There's going to be some references to King Philip's War coming up. I mean, if you want to stop this video and go watch it, go ahead. Or you can save it for later. Definitely watch it, though. While digging through the Penn Museum, I happened upon a lock discovered at Washington Borough, a Susquehannock site in Lancaster. It's a flintlock built on the base plate for a wheel lock. Similar examples have been found at other sites and hint to a Dutch trade gun. The late Leonard Day built several examples of these muskets, and they are very popular with collectors and reenactors today. In the time period, similar muskets would have allowed the Susquehannock to have a reliable ignition system, even in weather that wouldn't favor a matchlock. And flintlocks, when paired with cartridges, another Dutch trade item, would also be much faster to load. This is the same conversation we've had on this channel before when it comes to the buccaneers in the 17th century. Now, there was some trade with the English. You would have seen copper and brass kettles, steel axes, and knives. And it should be noted here that the kettles were often cut down to make jewelry. The Susquehannock pottery is very common, even into the contact period. And it's part of how we recognize Susquehannock sites. they tend to use faces and figures on the side of their pottery. In 1634, Maryland was established. The Piscataway, an Algonquin-speaking people, aligned themselves with Maryland after being the target of Susquehannock raids. Maryland and the Virginia-based traders actually ended up in a legal dispute over this because Virginia wanted to trade with Susquehanna. That's how they get the beaver pelts. Maryland's like, no, we want these guys. And in 1637, Maryland actually seized a Susquehanna island, Kent Island, which up until that point had been a Virginian trading post. That effectively ended all trade between the English and the Susquehannock. In 1638, after losing their southern trading partner, the Susquehannock reached out to a new settlement located on the Schuylkill River. Sweden had arrived and built Fort Christiana. Sweden, following the plans of King Gustavus Adolphus, had moved to create a North American colony. Landing aboard the Kalmar Nickel and the Fogle Grip was Peter Minuit and a small number of settlers, including a few soldiers. The New Sweden settlement was never very large, and they weren't as well supplied as the other colonies. Eager to make the colony profitable, the Swedes agreed to a trade deal with Susquehannock. In 1641, a Jesuit mission was attacked, allegedly by the Susquehannock. Now keep in mind, Maryland was established as a Catholic colony. Leonard Calvert, governor, the second son of the first Baron Baltimore, declared war on the Susquehannock. It was not until 1643 that the Marylanders were able to raise a force to attack them. This gets back to what I was talking about with the weapons technology. These were mostly matchlock armed militiamen going into land that they didn't know. In that time, the Susquehannock also decided to reach out to the Swedes for help. Now, I have not found any records of how many volunteers the Swedes sent, but apparently there were a few. One of the most annoying parts as a historian is sometimes you will be trying to find documents and you're hitting dead ends. Well, it turned out I was searching in Swedish. A lot of the documents for New Sweden were in Latin. Thank you, Sweden. So I definitely want to do a follow-up video to this in the future. Needless to say, the Marylanders were severely outclassed. 2 cannon and 15 prisoners were taken by the Susquehannock. Now, I spoke to a fellow 17th century historian. He focused a lot more on weapons. Matthew Leiby. He's appeared in one of our earlier videos doing pike drill. He's very certain that these were smaller pieces, not more than 2 pounds. Caliber, not their weight. Like 2-pound cannonball as opposed to a 2-pound cannon. Larger guns in the time, especially without established inland routes, would have been kept as coastal defense, or they would have been left on ships. I asked Drew the same question. He thinks they might have been potentially swivel guns, which could have been used on canoes. So either way, these were not large cannon. That said, they were still cannon, and in that time period, they meant more firepower than quite a few colonial militias as well as indigenous adversaries had. In a trade deal with New Sweden or the Dutch, there is also a potential that they got more cannon, because there was also requests for ammunition for the cannon. In the winter of 1652, the Susquehannock were attacked by the Mohawk. Although the attack was successfully repulsed, they decided to sign a treaty with Maryland. The Articles of Peace and Friendship gave Maryland their land in the Chesapeake, but reestablished trading rights, and there was also a request for more cannon. Again, nobody is certain if this request was fulfilled. This cannon point, though, is very important. The Susquehannock were adapting to the Europeans and were still, even in the 1650s, leading the arms race against the English and many of their neighbors. In 1654, as part of the Second Northern War, New Sweden decided to go take the Dutch Fort Casimir. It was a Dutch fort on the west side of the Delaware River, meant for easier trade with the Lenape and the Susquehannock. The Dutch, of course, were not happy. Under Peter Stuyvesant, operating with orders from the Dutch West India Company, keep in mind, companies in this time period had armies. I often say that, like, 17th century is like cyberpunk without the computers. I mean, it's early capitalism. It's before there were rules for capitalism. They decided to just conquer New Sweden, and they incorporated it as part of New Netherlands. Although the Dutch killed livestock and plundered homes, they ended up letting the Swedish and Finnish settlers stay with some level of autonomy. In 1660, the Susquehannock used their political ties to help end the First Esopus War between the Lenape-Esopus tribe and the Dutch. Also in 1660, the Oneida attacked Maryland, which forced Maryland to turn their treaty with the Susquehannock into a full-fledged alliance. Maryland saw the Susquehannock as their northern security, and at various points they would work together, sending militia or warriors to help each other respectively. Throughout the 1660s, even while suffering a smallpox epidemic, the Susquehannock successfully fought the Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga. None of this was occurring in a vacuum. I mean, I mentioned the Second Northern War. Throughout this entire period following the return of Charles II, the English were at least once a decade until 1674 at war with the Dutch. The various nations were constantly involved in a political chess game. And the thing is, Susquehannock were still doing very well for themselves. They knew how to use diplomacy and military power. In 1661, they withstood and defeated a siege by 800 Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga, and then afterward ambushed and defeated another war party. And by this point, many of the Native Americans were armed with flintlocks. The Susquehannock, sure, at their fort sites, more than likely had cannon still, but the tactics limited their use. They moved their village, their large village, in 1665. It's the one that we most talk about in the historical record. They moved it from Lancaster to York, and then things went downhill very quickly. In 1671, a Jesuit missionary described the Susquehannock warriors who had defeated a Seneca and Cayuga war party as being adolescents. The 1670 Susquehannock were outnumbered and often found themselves running between other tribes and the English. They were sadly forced to abandon some of their towns, including the large fort. They could, however, still mount defenses, even against the English. In 1675, they had moved into the Pocomoke area, and they were blamed for raids occurring in Maryland and Virginia. A John Washington, a Virginian settler, the paternal great-grandfather of George Washington, and Thomas Truman of Maryland led a combined militia force of nearly 1,000 against Susquehannock at their new settlement. They requested 5 leaders to come out and discuss terms with them, and then they murdered them. The siege lasted for 6 weeks, and the Susquehannock still held. They launched attacks from their fort and managed to kill 50 English. In early November, the survivors escaped, killing 10 more as they did. They escaped deeper into Virginia and set up a new site along the Meherrin River near the Siouan-speaking Occoneechee. In January 1676, the Susquehannock decided to raid plantations along the Rappahannock. They had worked with these supposed allies for years, and now they were turned on. They killed 36 colonists. Nathaniel Bacon, a merchant, was unhappy about this. See, Virginia was dealing politically with a large number of new immigrants from England who didn't much care for their neighbors. They wanted to remove the indigenous population, or, murder them. Their anger was overflowing at this point. Governor Berkeley was considered very corrupt, which, those of you who follow this channel, that's pretty much the norm for colonial governors. He just did not want to see the level of bloodshed, though, that happened in King Philip's War. It was pretty clear by this point that Susquehannock, although weakened, were still a force to be reckoned with. Now, Bacon becomes a leader to not just the English settlers, but indentured servants and even slaves. He would lead a war not just against Susquehannock, but to a certain extent against Virginia itself. This was a complex fight and is way outside the scope of this video. I really do want to do a longer form on Bacon's rebellion. At any rate, the Occaneechi joined with Bacon and attacked the Susquehannock. After the Occaneechi returned with Susquehannock prisoners, Bacon turned on them too. The Susquehannock were scattered. Many joined with other tribes. There is some evidence that some of the sites further north were still in use by the Susquehannock, but they weren't the same tribe they had been. Their numbers had dropped from the region of about, again, 5 to 7, 5 to 10,000 to 900 in 1676, and then as little as 300 in 1701. French maps at this point are no longer useful because they seem to keep repeating the same information well into the 7 Years' War. So, I mean, the way it honestly looks is it looks like somebody just copy, pasted, dragged the map data over to a new map, and it's the same stuff all the time in the Susquehanna Valley. I know there was at least one French trader operating with an English license in the 18th century. I think the map data at this point is just outdated. We know that in 1680, the Susquehannock with Seneca established a village near the Conestoga River. Later, members of the Oneida and Cayuga would join them. I mean, by this point, New Sweden, of course, is gone. And as part of... So, England lost the Anglo-Dutch Wars for the most part, but they did manage to get New Netherlands out of it. So, King Charles II owed a debt to a certain Admiral Penn. Admiral Penn, whose rebellious son was actually imprisoned. He rebelled so hard he became a Quaker. Admiral Penn's on his deathbed, and the debts ended up getting paid to his son instead. And William Penn would establish Pennsylvania after his father. And as a Quaker, it would be a place for religious freedom. And this is 1681. There is some debate over whether or not William Penn ever visited the tribe, but he did know of them. There's a lot of talk about the Treaty of Friendship. We don't know if it was ever formalized. There's a debate over if he met the Susquehannock around 1683 or if he met them in 1701. We don't know. And sadly, the records aren't that great. We do know that in 1718, the area was set aside by the provincial secretary, James Logan, as a 16,000-acre tract of land that had been held by William Penn for the use of the Conestogas. Conestoga town appears on maps of the period and in written records. In 1730, Scotch-Irish started moving in. They ended up being evicted at first, but eventually the Conestoga would be left with only 500 acres of that initial 16,000. Now, further north, we know that between 1683 and 1700, William Penn recognized the importance of the area where the Swadera enters the Susquehanna. Around this time, a map was made which shows an Indian town in the area. And then this map ends up getting copied over and over again. The earliest reference I can find for it is 1701. The same map is also attributed to 1715. So, early records of Middletown show that in 1718, there was a trading post here that was apparently fairly successful. There were Shawnee nearby, as well as several other tribes that had moved into the area. Around this time, we also start seeing Pine Ford appear. Pine Ford was the crossing if you were taking a land route from Lancaster or down to Lancaster. It most likely followed modern-day Route 441, and that in turn followed some of the early river trails, which were more than likely set up by the Susquehannock, possibly even earlier people. Okay, now this is where things are going to get a little bit dark because I want to talk about some of this a little bit more. One of the most recognizable sources of information for both historians and archaeologists alike are graves. The Susquehannock buried their dead outside their villages. Sometimes they actually used stone box graves, not too dissimilar from some of the graves seen in Northern Europe. Now, I use Northern Europe as a reference. It's not that the Susquehannock were from Northern Europe, so pseudo crowd, calm down. There is some potential lineage and development of this type of burial method and some of the stone working. We see it in New England, so there's probably a lineage. The thing that bothers me historically when looking at records is that in the 1740s and 50s, settlers moved into Middletown proper and described the remains of a village. There has been, to my knowledge, no record of human remains found during any of the construction. I don't think we, even with recent experience, truly recognize how absolutely destructive disease can be. Maryland did not have many of the same outbreaks of contagious diseases, but they did suffer from malaria, likely introduced to Chesapeake by merchants and slaves. But their colony spread itself out in such a way that contagious epidemics were not usually a thing. Now, in settlements like Massachusetts Bay, Jamestown, or Philadelphia, where people were more close together, yeah, outbreaks happened. That said, the Susquehannock during the 1660s would have experienced and been exposed to such things as smallpox and even the plague. Keep in mind, at this point in time, during the 1660s, there was a major outbreak of the plague in England. Now, could have transferred across to the Americas? We don't know, because there's no remains to study. The lack of graves in some of the later and intermediate sites, I think, is due to there not being enough people left to carry on that tradition. They lost between 80 and 90% of their population in just 10 years. And by 1700, that number was cut down by a further 2/3. Don't worry, it gets worse. In 1732, 423 acres at the mouth of Swadera was in possession of Jacob Job, who had acquired the land from one Anderson, an Irishman who'd acquired the site in 1728. In 1736, the site was crossed by a stagecoach route that would take a ferry further north across the river to the west shore. By 1750, there were 200 Scotch-Irish families in the Middletown area. By 1755, a George Fisher, a Quaker, came to the site to visit the tract of land, 691 acres and 53 perches, granted to him by his father, John Fisher. This is where Middletown says it was established. As I've discussed, I think an earlier date should be used instead. I mean, we are considered the oldest town in Dauphin County. I think we can do a little bit older. German immigrants would arrive, but they would mostly keep to the west side of Swadera, eventually settling in the area now known as Hummelstown. The Scotch-Irish kept to the west side, and that area would become known as Paxtang, which actually comes from the Algonkian Peshtek, which means the place of still water. Now, at this point in time, this is all part of Lancaster County, which also contains Conestoga Town. It continued on. It became a meeting place and a trading post until eventually the fur trade moved too far west for the town to continue for that purpose. But the Conestoga remained. The Scotch-Irish settlers began encroaching on indigenous lands belonging to the Lenape and Shawnee. During the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's Rebellion, their homes were targeted. Also keep in mind, some of them were illegally moving into these areas. These were areas that were off limits according to some of the treaties. Up near Harris's Ferry lived Reverend John Elder, a fiery Presbyterian minister from Edinburgh, Scotland. Known as the Fighting Parson, he was a man who kept a rifle alongside his Bible. He was angered by these attacks to the point that in 1763, Elder recruited 110 men to fight the Lenape and Shawnee. The Pennsylvania government was not going to help them. As a colony, they were already feeling the debt of the 7 Years' War, and that was only just ending. There were definitely fears, just as there had been in Maryland and Virginia decades before, of the conflict intensifying. They wanted to try to keep the peace. Elder realized his 110 men would be next to useless going to war on their own. So he got his men fired up anyway. If the pacifist English Quakers and German Moravians wouldn't do something, they would instead. Elder saw Conestoga town as the home of the Canaanites, and he saw he and his men as acting under the word of a Christian God. Never mind that the Conestoga by this point had converted decades before. Conestoga town was home to only a handful of people by this point: 7 men, 5 women, and 8 children. There were others who lived outside the town as servants and workers of various types. The Conestoga got by selling crafts, and they did small levels of farming and fishing. But mainly, they had to rely on charity. The Quakers, Moravians, and Anabaptists, they were more than willing to help with this. John Elder led his men from the area around Harris's Ferry, modern Harrisburg, along modern Route 230, which the section that goes along the river, which would have been one of these river trails. They would have turned at Middletown onto, again, modern day 441. And they would have almost certainly gone past the Eel Weir. They would have passed another when they got to Bainbridge, which is another town that has another Susquehannock site. Eventually, they got to Conestoga town. John Elder was never charged with any crime. An account claims that he realized what he was about to do, and he tried to get everyone to stop, but it was already too late. December 14th, 1763, 56 men rode into the village located east of modern-day Turkey Hill. And yes, for those of you from Pennsylvania, the name Turkey Hill does come from an actual hill called Turkey Hill. Turkey Hill Farm is located in that area, Turkey Hill Dairy. Too often in history, we hear about the victims, the Indians. We don't learn their names. They are just nameless characters in a play that led to America and nothing else. I don't care for that approach. I asked Drew what he thought of my idea, and he agreed. So I'm going to skip the niceties on this. Their names were Shihes, Wa'ashen, Tikale, Eskanesh, that was the son of Shihes, Tiawansha Iong, an elder, Kananenquas. They were brutally murdered by the men led by John Elder. They didn't just murder them, they scalped them and burned the village. Several of the Conestoga had been away that day. Of course, many were living in the surrounding community. They were given safety in the Lancaster workhouse, which, when you read some of the accounts of the period, they also call it a jail. And that's spelled Gaol. That's how you spell jail in the time period. So when you read witness accounts, if they reference the jail, they're talking about the Lancaster workhouse. Elder again claims to have tried to restrain the mob. Keep in mind this is 2 weeks later. December 27th, 1763, they attacked the workhouse. Kowinasi, Kayunke Gowa, the husband of Kowinasi. Kwa'achau, their child. Kanid Anguas, Tensi Dagwa, her husband, Chinawan, Sakis Hata, the husband of Chinawan, Sheika, child, he's given the Christian name Jacob, Ex Undas, Shihei's son, Tanquas, Christian name Christopher, another child, Hyenes, Peter, another child, Kokwo Iunquas, Molly, a child, Kelendo Ua, an infant, and Kanu Kiasung, Peggy, another child. They weren't just murdered, they were scalped and dismembered. The witnesses were horrified by this. There were only two survivors of Conestoga town. Their names were Michael and Mary. Governor John Penn offered a reward for the capture of the Paxtang boys. Early the next year, they'd march on Philadelphia, looking to murder the Moravian Lenape and Mohican. Now, originally, they lived near Bethlehem, which is like northeastern Pennsylvania. They were sent to New York for their safety, but the governor of New York refused. So they end up back in Pennsylvania at the Philadelphia barracks. Now, a character who always shows up in these videos around this time period, Benjamin Franklin, met the mob with a militia which included armed Quakers. Yes, that is how bad the Paxtang boys were, that the Quakers were armed and ready to fight them. Keep in mind, they had granted sanctuary to the Lenape and Mohican. Eventually, they were turned back. The Paxtang boys wanted all Native Americans expelled and for there to be a scalp bounty. The Pennsylvania Assembly refused the first part. This would have consequences later on. More murders and massacres would occur throughout the colony. Then in March 1765, a group that would become known as the Black Boys, they're called that because they'd paint their faces, would attack a pack train taking trade goods to Fort Pitt. They felt that the presence of alcohol, knives, and tomahawks were war goods. They thought that the English were arming the Native Americans. They would attack another train in May, and British soldiers stationed at Fort Loudoun would go out to investigate. I should note here I reached out to another Andrew Newman. He runs Fort Loudoun site, just to double check this information. They would actually take weapons and several prisoners. And the Black Boys decided to lay siege to the fort. They do have a reenactment there every year if you want to visit. Fort Loudoun's an amazing site. I always try to market them any chance I get because, again, they are a great site. They've allowed us to have a lot of opportunities, so definitely check them out. The British did free the prisoners, but they did not return the weapons. But as with the Paxtang boys, nobody was ever prosecuted. In 1768, John Penn would pay the Haudenosaunee 200 pounds in goods for 500 acres of Conestoga town. And then in 1775, Cayuga relatives of Shihei's would receive 300 pounds. A decade after the rebellion at Fort Loudoun, a new nation would start growing. Middletown, Pennsylvania would become a center for canals, the railroad, and would eventually fade into obscurity, save for that one site down 441, just past the Eel Weir a little ways. Which I should mention, 3 Mile Island does have some archaeology. There's been several archaic and later sites found. And like many of the islands, it does have good stratigraphy. Hopefully there's more digs in the future. So one thing that annoys me at the history books is the word extinct when it's applied to people. The Susquehannock did not go extinct. In the 19th century, attempts were made by Oneida descendants of the Conestoga to receive recognition. Then, in 1941, the Pennsylvania Historical Commission pushed Governor Arthur James to veto a bill that had passed the legislature, which would have granted land near Conestoga town. Now, the Conestoga descendants would have had to have paid for it, but it would have been extremely reduced prices. The Pennsylvania Historical Commission's excuse was that they all died at the massacre and were therefore extinct. See, conspiracy theorist? There is big government history. Shenandoah was a war leader of the Oneida. He was born Susquehannock. Even with what happened in 1763, he joined the American Revolution with 250 Oneida and was even given a recommendation by George Washington. Remember his paternal great-grandfather? Shenandoah's descendants survived. There are many others as well, spread across multiple tribes and intermarried with European settlers. I reached out to Drew. It turns out one of his cousins has Susquehannock heritage. The Susquehannock are not extinct. I am a historian. I love history even at its darkest. I love archaeology. I love being able to get into the ground or even along the river and touch things that somebody built or made long before me. What's funny is at the end of this, I actually have to thank a pseudo historian. I do think I agree to an extent with him, though. They were giants. In the 17th century, they stood toe to toe with the Europeans until it was finally disease that brought them down. And even then, even after horrific crimes committed against them, even though the politicized branch of history and archaeology claims they are extinct, they are still alive. Once more, as you stand near the Eel Weir today, you are just off the old road, Route 441, dating back to a trail likely known well by the Susquehannock. The walk isn't too far from Middletown, around 2 miles or less depending on path, and in the time, you wouldn't have had to worry about people's yards and could have potentially waded across the Swadera. There is no marker, but there's plenty of parking. If you choose to visit, don't move anything. Just stand and look for a while. Or maybe go fishing. There aren't eels, but the structure does make a great spot for smallmouth bass. At least if not too many fishermen watch this video. In the end, they're just stones in the river, but a pretty good history with them. If anyone has contact with the Susquehanna Conestoga tribe, Drew and I have both reached out to them recently and would love to get in touch with them. We want to get some more events started to raise awareness and to celebrate their awesome history, which, as a kid who grew up here, we all share a piece of it. Thank you. Have an awesome day.